Dr. Vel Ashari had reviewed 11,000 medical case files in her 400-year career as Chief Xenobiological Examiner for the Galactic Medical Board, and not one of them had ever made her put down her stylus, lean back in her chair, and ask her assistant to read the numbers to her out loud a second time. The file in front of her belonged to a species that had only been part of galactic medical record-keeping for 6 years, a species barely out of its own solar system, a species every other file in the board's 11,000-year archive had quietly, almost apologetically, classified as fragile. The species was humanity, and the report in front of Dr. Ashari did not use the word fragile even once. She had opened the file expecting the same thing she opened every new species file expecting: a modest stack of unremarkable data, a handful of predictable vulnerabilities, and a recommendation to file the species under one of the board's standard risk tiers, so the rest of the Assembly's bureaucracy could get on with the business of trade routes and treaty language. In 4 centuries of service, Dr. Ashari had classified over 300 newly contacted species. She had a rhythm for it. She had, if she was honest with herself, a certain boredom for it. Biology across the galaxy tended to rhyme. Carbon-based life found its own local optimum and settled there, and the differences between one intelligent species and the next were, more often than not, differences of degree rather than of kind. This file did not rhyme with anything. Her assistant, a quiet, methodical Ilkarish archivist named Pell, who had worked beside her for the better part of a century, found her still sitting with the file open long after the office's ambient lighting had dimmed to its evening cycle. "You have read this 3 times already, Doctor," Pell said. "It has not changed in the reading." "No," Dr. Ashari agreed. "It has not changed." "That is precisely the problem, Pell. I keep waiting for it to. Before we get into this one, if you're new here, welcome. If stories about humans breaking every rule the galaxy thought it understood are your thing, this is exactly where you want to be. Hit subscribe now, because what the Galactic Medical Board found in this file is going to change how you think about every hospital visit you've ever had. All right, let's get into it. It had started, as these things so often did, with a bureaucratic footnote. The Threshold Assembly required every member and observer species to submit a standardized biological threat and viability assessment within the first decade of first contact, a formality more than a science, used mostly to determine insurance premiums for trade vessels and appropriate quarantine protocols for diplomatic staff. Nobody expected the footnote attached to humanity's file to matter. Humans had been under observation for 6 years. 6 years was nothing. The Ilkarish had taken 2 centuries to fully catalog their own species biology, and they were the ones who built half the Assembly's medical infrastructure. The Nimarai, famously thorough, even by Assembly standards, had spent 140 years simply mapping the interactions between their own immune system and the 11 most common trace toxins in their homeworld's soil before they submitted a single conclusive report. But 6 years had been enough for something to go deeply, quietly wrong with every assumption the Assembly's medical establishment had ever made about the species called Homo sapiens. It began with Specialist Toran Vey, a Drassa field physician assigned to the human embassy on Coruscant Minor. A modest trade outpost humanity had been granted observer access to in the 2nd year after contact. Vey's job was uncomplicated. Monitor the health of the small human diplomatic staff, treat minor illness and injury, and file quarterly reports to the medical board confirming that the humans remained as expected, biologically unremarkable. It was, by Vey's own later admission, considered something of a punishment posting among physicians fresh out of their residencies. Nothing ever happened at a 6-person embassy outpost. You treated the occasional cold, you signed off on the occasional dental complaint, and you counted the years until a more interesting posting opened up somewhere with an actual hospital in it. His first 2 quarterly reports had been exactly as dull as Vey expected. A human logistics officer with a mild allergic reaction to a Coruscani spice compound. A junior attaché with a sprained wrist from what she described, somewhat sheepishly, as a poorly judged attempt at the embassy's small recreational climbing wall. Standard treatment, standard recovery, standard paperwork. Vey had begun to suspect the posting would be exactly as forgettable as his supervisors had warned him it would be. His 3rd quarterly report was the one that broke the pattern. Patient: Ambassador Daniel Osgood, human male, age 61 standard years, Vey had written. Presented with what the patient described as a torn ligament in the left knee, sustained during recreational activity. Standard assembly medical protocol for a comparable injury in a species with humanity's estimated tissue density and metabolic rate would predict a recovery period of approximately 4 to 6 standard months, with likely permanent reduction in joint mobility given the patient's advanced age. Patient returned to full mobility in 11 days. Patient reports no pain, no stiffness, and requested to resume the same recreational activity that caused the injury. When asked whether this concerned him, patient laughed and said, quote, "You should see what I did to my shoulder in my 20s, end quote. Vey had attached a note at the bottom of the report, the kind of note field physicians were trained never to write because it wasn't clinical, wasn't measured, and wasn't the kind of thing the medical board wanted cluttering up an official file. Recommend further study. Something is wrong with our numbers, or something is wrong with them. Vey later admitted, in an interview conducted years afterward, that he had almost deleted the note before submission. Field physicians who editorialized an official assembly documentation had a way of finding themselves reassigned to considerably less pleasant postings than a quiet trade outpost. He had written it anyway, he said, because he had spent 11 days watching a 61-year-old man walk with a slight limp, then a barely perceptible one, then none at all, and something in the back of his mind, some instinct that predated his medical training, had refused to let the observation pass without comment. Dr. Ashari had read that line 6 years later and felt, for the first time in her 400-year career, a chill she associated with the beginning of something the Assembly did not yet have language for. She pulled Vey's original file, then requested every human medical record the Assembly had accumulated since first contact. It took her research team 4 months to compile, cross-reference, and verify, because at first nobody believed the pattern was real. Instruments were checked. Assumptions were checked. An entire subcommittee was convened solely to confirm that human physicians on Earth were not, for reasons of national pride or cultural misunderstanding, simply exaggerating recovery times to Assembly observers. They were not exaggerating. If anything, human doctors consistently understated their own species' recovery rates, because to humans, healing quickly from injury was not remarkable. It was Tuesday. The data, once compiled, painted a picture that unsettled every member of the review committee in a different way. A human test pilot, thrown from a training vehicle at speeds that should have caused catastrophic, unsurvivable trauma by every biomechanical model the assembly possessed, had suffered 3 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and a concussion. He returned to active flight duty in 19 days. A human child, age 7, had contracted a respiratory illness that, according to the Assembly's own epidemiological models for a species with humanity's estimated immune complexity, should have required extensive medical intervention and carried a meaningful mortality risk. The child's mother gave him tea, kept him home from school for 4 days, and sent him back with a note. A human construction worker had severed 2 fingers in an industrial accident on a lunar colony. Standard assembly regenerative medicine, the most advanced tissue repair technology in galactic history, took approximately 11 weeks to regrow a comparable digit in most humanoid species, assuming the patient's biology was compatible with the treatment at all. Human physicians reattached the severed fingers surgically within 6 hours of the injury. Full function returned in 3 weeks. No regenerative technology was used. The fingers had simply been sewn back on and the body had done the rest, as though this were an unremarkable, almost boring, medical procedure rather than a minor miracle by every other species standard. A human deep-sea researcher, part of a joint assembly Earth oceanographic survey, had suffered severe hypothermia and near drowning after an equipment failure left her submerged in freezing water for 11 minutes. The accompanying assembly medical officer on the survey vessel, a Numeri physician named Selk Otterin, had begun drafting a fatality report before the woman was even out of the water, on the grounds that no known assembly species could survive oxygen deprivation of that duration in water that temperature. She was revived, treated for mild frostbite in 2 extremities, and was back on duty within the week. Otterin's own report, filed independently of Vay's, but arriving on Dr. Ashari's desk within the same month, contained an almost identical line at the bottom, written, Otterin later said, before he had any idea another physician on the far side of assembly space had written something similar. I do not understand how this patient is alive. I would like someone to explain it to me because I do not think I can, and I have practiced emergency medicine for 60 years. A human marathon runner competing in an exhibition event on a world with a hostile, oxygen-thin, high-heat atmosphere had collapsed with a core body temperature that assembly medical texts unanimously agreed should have caused irreversible organ damage within minutes. He was cooled, rehydrated, monitored overnight, and released the following morning with what the attending physician's notes described, almost begrudgingly, as normal blood work. And an elderly human woman, 78 years old, had suffered what her own doctors termed a moderate stroke, the kind that in most assembly species of comparable biological complexity carried a significant risk of permanent cognitive or motor impairment. She had undergone a course of rehabilitation that by assembly standards was almost aggressively minimal, and had returned within 4 months to what her family described in a follow-up note attached to the file almost as an afterthought as her regular gardening schedule. A human firefighter trapped for nearly 20 minutes in a structural collapse with severe smoke inhalation and thermal burns across a significant portion of his back was expected by every assembly burn treatment model on file to require months of regenerative grafting even with advanced intervention. Human physicians cleaned and dressed the burns using techniques centuries old by galactic standards, and released him to light duty in 5 weeks with scarring his own colleagues described as minimal. A solitary human researcher stationed at an Assembly Earth Joint Observation Post in Earth's own polar region had become separated from her survey team during a sudden storm and was not recovered for 19 hours, exposed the entire time to conditions that Assembly cold weather physiology charts listed as unsurvivable, past the 4-hour mark for a species of humanity's estimated size and metabolic profile. She was found alive, mildly frostbitten, irritated mostly, according to the recovery team's report, that she had missed a scheduled equipment check. It isn't that their medicine is advanced, Dr. Ashari told the review committee 4 months into the investigation, standing in front of a projection displaying every case file her team had gathered. Their medicine is, by our standards, primitive. They still use physical sutures. They still set broken bones with rigid external supports rather than field-generated bone lattice regenerators. Their hospitals do not have the equipment the Ilkarish have had in every clinic for the last 3,000 years. Then how, asked Counselor Bresh Itten, a Namarai administrator whose species had spent the last 2 millennia perfecting longevity medicine, do they keep surviving injuries that would kill or permanently cripple members of my own species half their age? Because Dr. Ashari said, I don't think humans need advanced medicine the way we do. I think their bodies are already doing something our medicine has spent 11,000 years trying to engineer artificially. A junior counselor from the Vesic Compact, a species so cautious about biological risk that they had not permitted an outside physician to examine one of their own citizens in over 4 centuries, asked the question that would end up defining the next 8 months of investigation. If that is true, Dr. Ashari, then what, precisely, are the limits of what this species body can do? And does anyone in this room actually know, or are we simply describing our own ignorance in more impressive language? Dr. Ashari did not have an answer for that question yet. It would take her team the better part of a year to find one. The medical board assigned her full authority to investigate, and Dr. Ashari built a team unlike any she had assembled before. Physicians, geneticists, and biomechanical engineers from 6 different member species, tasked with a single, deceptively simple question. How long does a human actually live, and why does the answer keep changing, depending on who you ask? The first surprise came from lifespan data itself. Human medical texts, freely shared under the Assembly's Open Information Exchange protocols, described an average human lifespan of 70 to 90 standard years, a number that, on its face, made humans one of the shortest-lived intelligent species in galactic record. The Ilkarish lived on average 1,100 years. Even the notoriously fragile Osaic Dominion averaged 3 centuries. The Vesic Compact, whose extreme biological caution Dr. Ashari had begun to understand was less a cultural quirk than a species-wide coping mechanism, averaged 410 years and had not recorded a single case of accidental death from physical trauma in over a century, largely because they arranged their entire civilization around never being anywhere an accident could plausibly occur. But the more Dr. Ashari's team examined why humans died at 70 to 90 years, rather than simply accepting the number as a fixed biological ceiling, the stranger the picture became. Humans did not appear to have a hard biological expiration built into their cells the way most known species did. Every species in the Assembly's records aged according to a programmed cellular clock, a defined number of divisions and repairs their bodies were capable of before systems began failing in a predictable, well-documented cascade. The Ilkarish cellular clock ran for 11 centuries. The Nomaroi clock ran for 4. The Vesic clock ran for just over 400 years and was, according to their own scientists, the single most heavily studied biological structure in their civilization's history, monitored and modeled down to the individual molecule in the hope of one day extending it. Every species had one, an internal countdown written into the architecture of their biology since the moment their evolutionary line first developed complex cellular life. Humans had a clock, too. Nobody could find where it stopped. "We've run the analysis 14 times, reported Dr. Kesamarn, a geneticist on loan from the Nomarai Longevity Institute, standing before Dr. Ashari's assembled team 8 months into the investigation. Human cellular repair mechanisms do not show the expected degradation curve. There is measurable senescence. Yes, cells do accumulate damage over time, the way ours do. But the repair systems compensating for that damage do not appear to weaken at the same rate the damage accumulates. In most species, repair capacity declines faster than damage accumulates, which is why we age and eventually die. In humans, the two curves are nearly parallel. They should not be dying from age at all. Statistically speaking, they should be dying from something else entirely, and simply mislabeling it as age because it happens to occur in older individuals. Explain that, Counselor Eaton said. Heart disease, cancer, organ failure caused by decades of environmental damage, poor diet, injury, and disease exposure that their bodies successfully repaired thousands of times before finally, eventually one repair came too late or one system was pushed past its capacity by something external. Dr. Marn pulled up a data model, human silhouettes overlaid with a slow-building red gradient, representing cumulative unrepaired damage. Their bodies are not designed to fail from age. Their bodies are worn down by everything else, and age is simply how much time it takes for that wear to finally outpace an extraordinarily persistent repair system. One of the biomechanical engineers on the team, a methodical Ilkarish researcher named Van Teresi, who had spent most of the presentation in silence, asked to see the raw repair rate data directly rather than the modeled projection. Dr. Marn obliged. Teresi studied it for what felt, to everyone in the room, like an uncomfortably long time. This is not a repair system that is merely slow to decline, Teresi finally said. This is a repair system that appears to actively compensate for its own aging. Look at the redundancy built into the cellular signaling pathways here and here. When one repair mechanism weakens, a secondary mechanism appears to increase its own activity to compensate. I have never seen this in any species we have catalogued. Most biological repair systems are singular. This one appears to have backups for its backups. So if you remove the wear, Dr. Ashari said quietly, already seeing where this was going, if you gave a human body the same clean, controlled, disease-free, injury-free environment we give our own citizens under standard longevity care. I don't know, Dr. Marn admitted. Nobody has ever had the chance to find out. Humans have never had access to what we would consider a genuinely safe environment for more than a single generation. Their entire species has spent its existence being worn down by war, disease, and their own planet's hostility toward them. We have never seen what a human looks like without that wear. Dr. Marn added one further note to her presentation before stepping down, one that Dr. Ashari would later say was the moment the investigation stopped feeling like a biological curiosity and started feeling like something closer to a responsibility. If I am right, Dr. Marn said, then every human who has ever died of what their own species called old age was, biologically speaking, a being who was simply never given the chance to keep going. That is not a footnote. That is potentially the largest accidental loss of otherwise viable life in this assembly's recorded history, and it happened quietly, on one small planet, without a single member species ever noticing it was happening. Quick pause here, because I want to hear from you before we get to the part of this story that made the medical board actually vote. Drop a comment telling me what you think a human lifespan would look like with full assembly medical support, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because the numbers the board eventually settled on are going to surprise you. Okay, back to the story. The medical board did not believe her at first. Neither did Dr. Ashari, not fully, not until the data from Earth's own historical medical record arrived 6 weeks later, a request humanity had answered with what Dr. Ashari would later describe as bewildering, almost touching cooperation, as though they had no idea their own history contained the answer to a question the entire galaxy was quietly holding its breath over. It came from an obscure human demographic study called In the Flat. Unglamorous language humans seemed to favor for even their most consequential discoveries, the centenarian registry. Humans who managed against every environmental disadvantage their species had ever inflicted on itself: war, famine, disease, poverty, industrial pollution. To avoid the wear Dr. Marn had described, humans who lived clean, low-stress, well-supported lives in the small pockets of their planet, where such things were possible, did not simply live a little longer than a 70 to 90-year average. They kept going. Dr. Ashari's team cross-referenced thousands of individual case files from the registry, and a pattern emerged that none of them had expected going in. It was not that a handful of statistical outliers had gotten lucky. It was that every single human who avoided the major categories of wear, untreated infection, catastrophic injury, chronic malnutrition, prolonged extreme stress, appeared to keep the same slow, steady repair curve running well past the point at which every other cataloged species biology would have failed entirely. There was no visible wall. There was only ever another decade, and then another, for as long as the wear stayed away. The oldest verified human on record at the time of first contact had lived to 122 years. Not because that was any kind of ceiling, Dr. Ashari's team determined, but because that was simply the oldest human who happened to have avoided enough wear for long enough before something eventually caught up to her. Every biological marker in the woman's final medical records, taken in the last year of her life, showed cellular repair function still operating at a level that would have been considered remarkable in a being half her age in any other species in the Assembly's records. Her name, buried in the flat administrative language of the registry entry, had been Jean. She had outlived 2 husbands, 4 siblings, and by the time of her death every person she had grown up with. Her final medical examination, conducted less than a year before her death as part of an unrelated research study, noted in clinical terms what her own attending physician had apparently found remarkable enough to underline by hand in the original paper record: A detail Dr. Ashari's team found almost unbearably poignant once they finally understood what it meant. Cardiovascular function consistent with a patient several decades younger. The attending physician at the time had simply assumed the woman was an unusually well-preserved specimen of an otherwise unremarkable species. Nobody, least of all the physician who wrote it, had understood that they were looking at a body that had simply never been told it had to stop. She had not died of old age. She had died ultimately of a fall, an injury her body had very nearly repaired before a secondary infection, the kind of infection that any assembly hospital could have cured in an afternoon with technology as basic as a standard antimicrobial field, had finally overwhelmed a system that had, up until that final month, been quietly winning the exact same fight it had been fighting for 12 decades. She wasn't dying of being human. Dr. Ashari told the full medical board, in the presentation that would eventually be filed, debated, contested, and ultimately upheld as the most consequential biological reclassification in assembly history. She was dying of not having access to something every citizen of every assembly member species has had for the last 4,000 years, basic infection control, and even without it, she very nearly won anyway. The final report Dr. Ashari submitted to the Ninth Council's Medical Subcommittee ran to over 4,000 pages, but its conclusion, once every geneticist, physician, and biomechanical engineer on her team had signed off on it, fit into a single paragraph that would be quoted, argued over, and eventually memorialized in assembly medical textbooks for generations to come. Homo sapiens does not exhibit a fixed biological lifespan ceiling comparable to any other cataloged species in assembly records. Observed mortality in the species correlates almost entirely with external factors: injury, disease, environmental harm, and historically inadequate medical infrastructure, rather than internal cellular senescence. Provided with assembly standard medical support, environmental stability, and infection control, preliminary modeling suggests Homo sapiens is not merely long-lived, but functionally unbounded in lifespan absent external cause of death. Recommend reclassification from Tier 4 standard biological risk to Tier 0 indefinite viability, commonly understood among member species as the classification reserved for species considered, for practical medical purposes, effectively immortal. The medical subcommittee did not vote on the reclassification quickly. Nothing the assembly did was quick, and a reclassification this significant, one that would fundamentally alter how humanity was treated under every trade agreement, insurance protocol, and diplomatic framework the assembly maintained, required 6 months of hearings, cross-examinations, and increasingly heated debate. The Vesic representative, true to her species' character, requested 3 separate independent replications of the entire study before she would even consent to discussing the reclassification, and expressed on the record a degree of professional discomfort at the idea of a species whose upper biological limit could not be modeled with certainty. We build our entire civilization around knowing exactly how much risk we are carrying at any given moment, she said during the 2nd month of hearings. You are asking this council to accept a species into full assembly standing whose fundamental biological risk profile is, and I want to be precise about this, unknown. Not low, not high, unknown. I am not certain the compact has a framework for that word. A junior Vesic aide, present only to record the proceedings and not by custom, permitted to speak during formal session, was later quoted in an internal memo that eventually found its way, unofficially, into Dr. Ashari's research archive. We have spent 4 centuries building models to tell us exactly how a Vesic life could end. The aide had written so that we could spend every remaining year of it avoiding that ending. I do not think any of us know what to do with a species that never needed the model in the first place. A representative from the Assaic Dominion, whose civilization had built the better part of its economy on the assumption that younger, shorter-lived species eventually exhausted themselves and their resistance, was noticeably quieter than usual throughout the hearings, a silence several other counselors privately remarked upon, though none of them yet understood its full significance. Counselor Itten, whose own species had spent 2,000 years perfecting the most advanced longevity medicine in galactic history and had achieved at the very edge of their science a maximum verified lifespan of 430 years, sat through the entire process with an expression Dr. Ashari could only describe as quietly, deeply unsettled. "We spent 2 millennia, Itten said, during the final hearing, developing technology to extend Nemarine lifespan by roughly 60% beyond its natural ceiling. We consider this one of the great triumphs of our civilization. And you are telling this council that a species we classified 6 years ago as biologically primitive may simply not have a ceiling at all, and never did. And the only reason we didn't notice sooner is that they've spent their entire history too busy dying of things that had nothing to do with actually being human." "That is my finding, yes," Dr. Ashari said. "Then what happens," Eaton asked, "when they get access to the rest of what we have? Not just infection control, full assembly medical infrastructure, regenerative technology, environmental stabilization, everything we give our own citizens as a matter of course." Dr. Ashari had no answer for that, and she said so plainly in front of the full council. "I don't know, Counselor. Nobody does. We have never, in the recorded history of this assembly, encountered a species whose upper lifespan limit was simply unknown, because no one had ever lived long enough in a safe enough environment to find it. I can tell you what the data shows. I cannot tell you what it means for a species like that to exist among us permanently, indefinitely, learning everything we know and never running out of time to use it. The reclassification passed, in the end, by a narrower margin than anyone expected, given how thoroughly the data supported it. 7 votes in favor, 2 abstentions, and 0 votes against, a result that told its own story about how uncomfortable the 9th Council's member species had become with a conclusion none of them had wanted to reach. Word reached Earth's diplomatic mission on Coruscant Minor 3 weeks later, delivered in the flat, procedural language the Assembly used for every official communication, regardless of how enormous its actual implications were. Notice of biological classification update. The species designated Homo sapiens has been reclassified from Tier 4 standard biological risk to Tier 0 indefinite viability, effective immediately. This classification acknowledges the absence of a demonstrated biological lifespan ceiling in the subject species, contingent upon standard environmental and medical safety conditions. All Assembly member species are advised to update trade, insurance, and diplomatic protocols accordingly. On Earth itself, the notice arrived through more conventional channels weeks later, buried in a routine diplomatic bulletin that most news outlets initially filed under minor regulatory update rather than front page It took a retired human epidemiologist scrolling through the bulletin out of professional curiosity to notice what the flat assembly language actually meant, and to write a single, widely shared public post asking a question that would end up defining an entire generation's relationship with the discovery. If a species that spent its entire history dying young from things that had nothing to do with actually being human just got told it might not have to die at all anymore, she wrote, why does that headline read like an insurance memo? Ambassador Daniel Osgood, the same man whose torn knee ligament had started the entire investigation 11 months earlier, read the notice twice before calling specialist Haran Vey, the Drassa physician whose stubborn quarterly report had refused to accept an unremarkable explanation for an 11-day recovery time. Did you know this was going to happen? Osgood asked. I suspected something, Vey admitted. I did not suspect this. What does it actually mean, practically, for us? Vey considered the question for a long moment before answering, because it was, he realized, a genuinely difficult question to answer honestly. It means, he said, that every other species in this assembly has spent its history racing against a clock built into its own cells, a clock that tells them no matter what they achieve, no matter how safe or comfortable their lives become, that there is a hard ceiling waiting for them eventually. It means you do not have that clock. It means the only thing that has ever killed a human being is something that happened to you, not something that was always inevitably going to happen regardless. It means, Ambassador, that for the first time in 11,000 years of galactic medical history, we have finally met a species that isn't dying. It's just been getting unlucky over and over again for its entire recorded existence. Osgood was quiet for a long moment. That's a strange thing to hear, he finally said. We've spent our whole history thinking of ourselves as the ones who die too easily. Every other species we've met so far seems tougher than us. Thicker skin, better armor, faster reflexes. We're the soft ones, the fragile ones. You were never fragile, Vey said. You were simply unprotected. There is a difference, Ambassador, and it is a very large one. A being who dies because their body has an expiration date written into it is fragile. A being who dies only because no one had ever built them a roof to stand under is merely unlucky. Give that being a roof, and you will find out very quickly that fragile was never the right word at all. Vey had said this kind of thing before. In the 6 years he had spent quietly watching humans heal from things that should have ended them. But he had never said it quite so plainly, and he found, once the words were out, that he believed them more fully than he had expected to. He had come to this posting expecting to spend his career treating an unremarkable species through an unremarkable list of unremarkable complaints. He would leave it whenever that day eventually came, having watched an entire galaxy quietly rewrite what it thought it knew about mortality itself, because one field physician had refused to file a boring explanation for an injury that had healed too fast to be boring. Osgood asked one more question before ending the call, one that Vey would later say he thought about more than any other moment in the entire 6-year posting. If we're not fragile, Osgood said, then what have we actually been this whole time without knowing it? Vey did not have a clean answer and told him so. Patient, he finally offered. I think the word is patient. You simply did not know you were being patient because nobody had ever told you there was anything to wait for. The reclassification changed more than paperwork. though it took years for the full weight of it to settle across assembly society, and longer still for humanity itself to fully absorb what had been quietly decided about them in a chamber none of them had been present for. Insurance premiums for human-crewed vessels dropped to nearly nothing, since the actuarial models used to calculate them had always assumed a fixed, calculable lifespan, a number that no longer existed for the species in question. Diplomatic protocols shifted, subtly but unmistakably, as assembly species who had spent 6 years treating humanity as a promising but fundamentally short-lived curiosity began quietly recalculating what it meant to negotiate, trade, and build alliances with a species that might simply still be present, learning, adapting, and growing, long after every other party at the table had lived out their own species' natural span and passed into memory. The Vesic Compact, characteristically, responded to the reclassification by drafting an entirely new category of diplomatic protocol, specifically for what their internal memos referred to as indefinite tenure partners, a bureaucratic phrase that took their legal division the better part of a year to finalize, largely because no existing template in Vesic law had ever needed to account for a treaty partner who might simply still be sitting at the negotiating table in 400 years. Dr. Ashari found herself, in the years that followed, treated as something between a celebrated scientist and a cautionary tale, depending on which member species she was speaking to. The Ilkarish, whose own history included nearly being erased by an assembly that had once badly underestimated them, sent her a formal commendation. The Osaic Dominion, whose harvest doctrine had been built on the assumption that pre-warp species were, almost without exception, disposable and short-lived, quietly stopped issuing new Tier 7 harvest assessments altogether, a policy change no one in the Dominion ever officially explained, though everyone in the assembly understood exactly why. We built our entire economy on the idea that we were the patient ones, a retired Osaic trade official admitted, years later, in an interview Dr. Ashari's team included as an appendix to their final published study. We could wait out any species, outlive any resistance. Every civilization we ever harvested eventually ran out of time because every civilization has a clock. We never imagined meeting one that didn't. We are still not entirely sure what we are supposed to do with that information. The same official, pressed further by Dr. Ashari's research team on what the Dominion actually intended to do now that its founding economic assumption had quietly collapsed, offered an answer that ended up circulating through assembly academic circles almost as widely as the reclassification itself. We are, he said, going to do the only thing a species can do when it discovers its oldest certainty was never true. We are going to sit very still for a while and think very carefully about who else we might have been wrong about. Counselor Itten, whose own species had spent 2,000 years chasing a lifespan extension that humans, it turned out, may never have needed engineering to achieve, put it more simply in the closing remarks of the very last hearing on the matter. We spent our history trying to buy more time, Itten said. It seems we have just discovered a species that was never selling any in the first place. It was simply never told it had to stop. It took Earth itself considerably longer to reach anything resembling Itten's clarity. For the first few years after the reclassification, the reaction across humanity's own institutions was less a single conclusion than a slow, uneven argument with itself. Physicians who had spent entire careers treating age itself as an adversary to be managed, rather than a mystery to be solved, found themselves rereading decades of their own research with a new and faintly vertiginous question in mind, one none of their training had ever prepared them to ask seriously. What if the thing we have been calling aging was never the disease at all, only the scar tissue left behind by everything we failed to prevent? Insurance actuaries on 3 continents spent months quietly revising mortality tables that had not meaningfully changed in generations, while public commentators argued, sometimes furiously, over whether the Assembly's findings meant anything practical for a species that still could not universally guarantee its own citizens clean water, safe housing, or basic infection control, let alone the Assembly's standard medical infrastructure the reclassification had been contingent upon in the first place. The finding, several of them pointed out, was not a gift. It was a diagnosis of everything that had been stolen and a bill for everything that might still be owed. Ambassador Osgood, for his part, found himself asked the same question by nearly every human reporter who managed to get an interview in the months that followed, and gave, by his own later admission, a slightly different honest answer each time, because he had not yet settled on one himself. What he did say, consistently, in every version of the answer, was some form of what Vey had told him on that first call. That being told you were not fragile, after a lifetime spent believing you were, did not feel like triumph so much as it felt like grief for every year that assumption had cost, quietly, without anyone ever writing it down as a loss. Dr. Vel Ashari closed the file on Ambassador Daniel Osgood's torn ligament for the last time on the same day the Assembly's official biological registry updated humanity's classification for good, a small, almost unremarkable administrative act that nonetheless represented the single largest reversal of a species' medical understanding in the Assembly's 11,000-year history. She thought as she closed it of Specialist Vey's original note, the one clinical field physicians were never supposed to write, the one that had started everything. Something is wrong with our numbers, or something is wrong with them. Neither had been wrong in the end. The numbers had simply never been asked to describe a species like this one before, a species that did not carry its own ending written into its cells the way every other being the Assembly had ever met did, a species that had spent its entire existence assuming it was the fragile one, the short-lived one, the one racing a clock, when in fact it had never been racing anything at all. It had simply never been given the chance to stop running from everything else long enough to notice the clock had never been there. Van Teresi, the Ilkarish engineer, who had first noticed the redundant repair pathways buried in the raw data, kept a copy of the final report on his desk long after the case was formally closed, not because his own contribution required it, but because he told Dr. Ashari once over what had become an occasional shared meal between colleagues who had spent a year staring at the same impossible numbers together. He found he still could not quite stop thinking about the shape of it. "We build machines that fail gracefully," he said. "We build medicine that assumes decline and plans around it. This species built nothing of the kind because it never needed to. It simply kept repairing itself, quietly, patiently, for as long as anyone let it, and called the results ordinary. I have spent 300 years studying biology, Doctor, and I am no longer certain we understood what the word resilience was supposed to mean before we met them." Dr. Ashari agreed with him more than she ever said aloud in any official record. In 400 years of practice, she had built her entire understanding of biology around the idea that every living thing carried its own ending inside it somewhere, waiting patiently to be found. Humanity had quietly, almost accidentally, proven her wrong about something she had never once thought to question, and she found that the discovery did not diminish her 4 centuries of expertise so much as it reminded her, gently and a little humbly, of exactly how large the galaxy still was, and how much of it remained entirely unmapped. Dr. Ishari did not have a tidy answer to that either, and had stopped by then expecting to find one. Some discoveries, she had come to believe, were not meant to end in a conclusion so much as in a permanently revised sense of how much the galaxy still had left to teach a 400-year-old physician who had once believed she had seen everything biology had to offer. If this is the first time you're finding out how close humanity came to living out its entire history without anyone, including humans themselves, ever realizing what they actually were, you are not alone. Even the Galactic Medical Board didn't see it coming until a single stubborn field physician refused to accept an ordinary explanation for an extraordinary recovery. Thank you so much for staying with me through this one. If this story gave you chills, do me a favor and let me know in the comments what part hit you hardest. I read every single one. If you're new here, welcome again, and if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss the next one. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay curious, and stay human.